The first rays of sunlight broke through the towering skyline of Chicago, casting a golden hue on the bustling streets below. In a compact yet elegant apartment in the heart of the city, Lila Carter was starting her day. Her alarm clock buzzed at precisely 6 a.m., though she had been awake for several minutes, her mind already running through the tasks ahead. As a federal prosecutor, meticulous planning wasn't just a habit, it was a necessity. Lila's home reflected her organized nature. Legal briefs were neatly stacked on her desk, color-coded by priority, while her coffee maker sputtered rhythmically in the kitchen. At 37 years old, she was at the pinnacle of her career, a woman who had not only survived but thrived in a world that often underestimated her. Her framed law degree from Northwestern University hung prominently on the wall, a reminder of the sacrifices she had made to get here. But today wasn't about high-stakes federal cases. Today, she was heading to municipal court for something far less dramatic, contesting a parking ticket. "It's just a small matter," she muttered, tying her dark curls into a sleek ponytail. She glanced at the ticket resting on her kitchen counter. The fine was minimal, but the principle was what mattered. The sign where she had parked had been obscured by construction debris, an oversight she was determined to challenge. Despite the simplicity of the issue, Lila couldn't help but approach it with the same precision she applied to her career. She had photos of the obstructed sign, copies of her correspondence with the city, and even a printout of the municipal parking regulations. She smiled at her reflection in the mirror, pulling on a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white blouse. "Prepared as always," she said, grabbing her coffee and heading for the door. The morning air was crisp as she stepped into her black sedan, a car she had earned after years of hard work and long nights. As she navigated through the city's early traffic, her thoughts wandered to the contrast between her usual courtroom environment and the one she was about to enter. Municipal court was a far cry from the federal courtroom where she prosecuted complex cases, often involving fraud, corruption, and human trafficking. There, she commanded respect not just for her position, but for the sharp intellect and unrelenting determination she brought to every case. Here, she would simply be another face in a crowded room. She adjusted the radio, letting the soothing voice of an NPR anchor fill the car as she drove. It was 8:15 a.m., and she was on track to arrive well before her 9 a.m. appearance. Lila liked being early. It gave her time to observe, prepare, and more importantly, set the tone for whatever was to come. Unbeknownst to her, this day would be far from ordinary. It would test her patience, challenge her principles, and ultimately redefine the way she viewed the very system she had dedicated her life to serving. As she pulled into the parking garage near the courthouse, she couldn't have imagined that a seemingly insignificant ticket would lead to a confrontation that would ripple through the legal community and beyond. Lila locked her car, straightened her blazer, and headed toward the courthouse steps, carrying with her the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far greater battles. This would be just another small victory in her long career, or so she thought. The setback. The courthouse stood tall and imposing, a stark contrast to the bustling chaos of downtown Chicago. Lila Carter glanced at her watch as she approached the entrance, 8:25 a.m. She was perfectly on schedule, as always. With her documentation neatly tucked into a leather folder, she felt a sense of calm confidence. Today's case wasn't about proving someone's guilt or innocence. It was about the principle of fairness, something she held deeply in her heart. Just as she entered the marble-lined lobby, her phone buzzed in her purse. She ignored it at first, her focus set on finding the correct courtroom. But the buzzing persisted, and curiosity got the better of her. Pulling her phone from her bag, she saw the name David Pierce flashing on the screen. David was her direct supervisor, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. A call from him this early could only mean one thing: something urgent. Lila hesitated for a moment before answering. "Good morning, David," she said, her tone professional but warm. "Lila, I know you're not in the office today, but we have an issue with the Sanchez trafficking case. The defense just filed a motion to suppress critical evidence, and it could jeopardize the entire prosecution." His voice was calm, but edged with urgency. Lila's heart sank. The Sanchez case was one of the most significant cases in the district, involving an extensive human trafficking ring that had devastated countless lives. Losing key evidence could unravel months of painstaking work. "What's the deadline for our response?" she asked, already bracing herself for what was to come. "The judge has given us until noon," David replied. "I've emailed you the documents. I need your analysis as soon as possible." Lila glanced at the clock above the courthouse lobby entrance. 8:30 a.m. She calculated the time it would take to review the motion thoroughly, provide her feedback, and still make it to her 9 a.m. hearing. It would be tight, but she didn't see any other option. "Understood," she said, her voice steady. "I'll review the motion and get back to you shortly." "Thanks, Lila. I know this is asking a lot, but you're the best person to handle it." Ending the call, Lila quickly scanned the lobby for a place to sit. Spotting a small bench near the windows, she pulled out her laptop and connected it to her phone's hotspot. Within minutes, she was immersed in the legal arguments of the defense's motion. The documents were dense, filled with technical jargon and carefully constructed loopholes. She scribbled notes furiously in her notebook, her mind racing to identify weak points in their arguments. Time slipped away as Lila worked. When she finally looked up, it was 8:55 a.m. Her heart sank. The courtroom was still 2 floors away, and she knew that finding it would take precious minutes. Hastily gathering her things, she made her way to the elevators, hitting the button repeatedly, as if that would make it arrive faster. As the elevator doors opened, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from David, thanking her for her preliminary feedback and assuring her that her insights would help the team craft a strong response. Lila allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Despite the tight timeline, she had managed to provide meaningful input on one of the most critical cases on her docket. But her relief was short-lived. The elevator dinged, and she stepped into the hallway, scanning for courtroom 4B. It was now 9:05 a.m., and she was late. For the first time in her career, she felt a pang of anxiety at the thought of walking into a courtroom after the session had already begun. She prided herself on punctuality, viewing it as a sign of respect for the legal system she served. Still, she reminded herself, her delay wasn't frivolous. The Sanchez case could determine the fate of dozens of trafficking victims. With that thought bolstering her resolve, she took a deep breath and opened the door to courtroom 4B. Inside, the session was already underway. Judge Gerald Hansen sat at the elevated bench, his stern face framed by the heavy wood paneling of the courtroom. The atmosphere was tense, the kind that discouraged interruptions. Lila stepped in quietly, clutching her folder as she made her way to the defendant's area. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, drawing the attention of nearly everyone in the room. Judge Hansen paused mid-sentence, his sharp eyes narrowing as they landed on her. Lila felt the weight of his gaze, but she kept her posture straight and professional. She had faced far more intimidating figures in her career, and she wasn't about to let this moment shake her. "Step forward," the judge said, his tone icy. Lila did as instructed, her expression calm but alert. She had no idea that this interaction would set off a chain of events that would ripple far beyond this courtroom, challenging the very foundations of the justice system she had dedicated her life to serving. The encounter. The courtroom fell silent as Lila Carter approached the podium. The tension in the air was palpable, each step echoing across the polished wood floors. Judge Gerald Hansen, a man whose reputation for strictness bordered on infamy, loomed behind the elevated bench. His gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of authority, but it was the scowl on his face that caught Lila's attention. "You must be Miss Carter," he said, his voice laced with disapproval. "Your case was scheduled for 9 a.m. It is now 9:10. Do you believe your time is more valuable than the court's?" Lila stood tall, her posture impeccable, despite the clear hostility in his tone. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and professional, "I apologize for my tardiness. I was delayed by—" "I don't need your excuses," the judge interrupted, his gavel tapping lightly on the bench for emphasis. "This courtroom operates on punctuality. Without it, we have chaos. Do you understand?" Lila's jaw tightened, but she refused to let her frustration show. Years of dealing with adversarial defense attorneys in high-stakes cases had taught her the value of composure. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." Good, Hansen said, shuffling the papers on his desk with an air of exaggerated efficiency. To ensure that this lesson is not lost on you, I am issuing a $700 fine for contempt of court. Gasps rippled through the room. Lila could feel the eyes of the other defendants and attorneys boring into her, their shock evident. She glanced around, quickly noting the discrepancies in the room. Earlier, a white man in a business suit had arrived 5 minutes late, and Hansen had barely acknowledged him. Another young woman, dressed casually, had entered moments before Lila, yet she sat quietly in her seat, unnoticed by the judge. Your Honor, Lila said carefully, I believe. Enough, Miss Carter, Hansen interrupted again, raising his gavel slightly. This is not a negotiation. You will pay the fine before leaving today. Perhaps next time, you'll understand the importance of respecting this court's time. Lila felt a wave of indignation rise within her. The fine itself was harsh but manageable. It was the principle of the matter that gnawed at her. She could see the bias etched into Hansen's every word and gesture, the way he dismissed her professionalism as if it were irrelevant. From the corner of her eye, she caught the sympathetic gaze of the courtroom bailiff, an older black man who seemed to understand what was unfolding. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression, hesitated briefly before typing the fine into the system, her discomfort evident. Do you have anything further to say? Hansen asked, his tone making it clear he expected silence. Lila straightened her shoulders and met his gaze head-on. Not at this time, Your Honor. Good. Step back, he said, turning his attention to the next case on his docket. For him, the matter was resolved. But for Lila, it was far from over. As she returned to her seat, she pulled out her phone and discreetly typed notes about the exchange. Every word, every inflection, every detail mattered. This wasn't just about her fine. It was about something much larger, a pattern of inequality that she could no longer ignore. From her seat, she watched as the proceedings continued. Late arrivals who didn't look like her were greeted with mild reprimands or, in some cases, none at all. The disparity was glaring, and it fueled a determination within her that had been simmering for years. Lila Carter wasn't just a defendant contesting a parking ticket. She was a federal prosecutor who had spent her career fighting for justice. And in this moment, she realized she was being called to fight for it once again. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed or diminished in a courtroom like this one. Her pulse steady, she silently resolved to take a stand. Judge Hansen may have thought this was the end of the matter, but for Lila, it was just the beginning. The courtroom proceedings continued, but Lila Carter remained focused, her mind racing. She carefully observed Judge Hansen as he handled the next few cases, noting the stark differences in his demeanor and rulings. When a young white man entered late, Hansen simply nodded at him and moved on. A middle-aged Asian woman received a mild verbal warning for her tardiness. Each interaction underscored the bias Lila had already experienced firsthand. The injustice gnawed at her. She had spent years prosecuting criminals who preyed on the vulnerable, believing in the ideal of an impartial justice system. Yet here she was, witnessing its very flaws laid bare. Finally, the judge turned back toward her. Miss Carter, are you ready to proceed with your parking ticket case? Lila rose from her seat, but instead of stepping forward immediately, she reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out her credential holder. Its gold federal seal caught the light as she walked purposefully to the podium. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady but firm. Before we address the matter of my parking ticket, I believe it is necessary to formally introduce myself for the record. The courtroom grew silent, every eye on her. Judge Hansen's expression shifted from disinterest to mild irritation, but he gestured for her to continue. I am Lila Carter, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, she said, holding her credentials up for all to see. My work involves prosecuting some of the most complex and impactful cases in this district, including the Sanchez human trafficking case, which was the reason for my delayed arrival this morning. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Hansen's face drained of color, and for the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. The courtroom clerk froze mid-typing, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. Lila continued, her tone unwavering. I take full responsibility for my tardiness, but I believe it's important to highlight what I've observed during these proceedings. Since my arrival, multiple individuals have entered this courtroom late. Some received no reprimand at all, while others, including myself, were subjected to harsher treatment. Judge Hanson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miss Carter, this is highly irregular. What is irregular, Your Honor? Lila interrupted, her words sharp but respectful. Is the apparent disparity in how defendants are treated in this courtroom. As an officer of the court, it is my duty to uphold justice, not only in federal cases, but in every environment where fairness is called into question. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. The bailiff, standing stoically by the door, allowed a small, approving smile to cross his face. A young law student seated in the back frantically scribbled notes, sensing she was witnessing a pivotal moment. I have documented, Lila said, holding up her phone, several instances this morning of inconsistent application of penalties based on observable factors such as race and socioeconomic status. These patterns are not just concerning, they are unacceptable. Judge Hanson's face reddened, his earlier confidence replaced with visible discomfort. Miss Carter, I suggest we discuss this matter in chambers. With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe this discussion belongs in the open courtroom, Lila replied. Her voice carried the weight of years spent in high-stakes litigation, and the authority in her tone was impossible to ignore. The judge fumbled with his papers, his usual air of control crumbling. Perhaps we can reconsider the fine. The fine, Lila said, cutting him off, is not the issue. Dismissing it now would only further highlight the disparities I've observed. Instead, I propose that this court commit to an immediate review of its records over the past year to ensure consistency in its rulings. Additionally, I recommend bias training for all court personnel, including the bench. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Defendants, attorneys, and even the court staff exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and admiration. This was no ordinary confrontation. It was a direct challenge to a system that many had long accepted as unchangeable. Judge Hanson, visibly flustered, attempted to regain his composure. These are serious accusations, Miss Carter. They are not accusations, Your Honor. They are observations supported by facts, Lila replied. And as a federal prosecutor, it is my duty to bring such matters to light. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent. Hanson stared at Lila, his authority shrinking under the weight of her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice subdued. I will take your concerns under advisement. Lila nodded, stepping back from the podium. She had said what needed to be said, and the seed had been planted. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had walked into courtrooms like this one, only to leave feeling defeated by a system stacked against them. As Lila returned to her seat, she could feel the eyes of the room on her. The elderly black man in the gallery gave her a subtle nod, his expression one of quiet pride. The young law student mouthed the words, "Thank you." Lila knew this was only the beginning. The true fight for justice was about to begin, and she was ready to lead it. The ripple effect. By the time Lila Carter stepped out of the municipal courthouse, the air felt heavier than it had when she entered. It wasn't just the weight of her own experience. It was the energy of the room she had just left, charged with disbelief, admiration, and quiet outrage. She knew the confrontation with Judge Hanson wasn't merely a personal stand. It was a flashpoint for something larger. As she descended the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed incessantly. A quick glance revealed text messages from colleagues, friends, and even a few unfamiliar numbers. Word was already spreading about what had unfolded in courtroom 4B. Unbeknownst to Lila, several attendees had taken to social media, recounting the incident in vivid detail. A young law student who had been sitting at the back of the room posted, "Just witnessed a federal prosecutor call out systemic bias in court. She didn't just stand up for herself, she stood up for all of us. Justice in action, Lila Carter." The post quickly went viral, shared by local activists, attorneys, and community leaders. Within hours, hashtags like Lila Carter and Equal Justice began trending in Chicago. The legal community reacts. In legal offices across the city, phones buzzed with the news. Colleagues who knew Lila weren't surprised by her actions. "That's classic Lila," said Marcus Bryant, a fellow prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. "She's always been about fairness. no matter how small or large the case. But the story also ignited a deeper conversation among lawyers. In quiet conversations over coffee and hurried text exchanges, they began sharing their own stories of judicial bias. A black attorney recounted how a judge had dismissed her arguments as emotional, only to later adopt the same points when repeated by her white male co counsel. Another attorney described a case where fines for minority defendants were consistently higher than those for white defendants facing identical charges. For many, Lila's actions were a catalyst, a signal that it was possible to challenge the status quo without fear of retaliation. Community outrage. Meanwhile, outside the legal circles, the public response was swift and passionate. Local advocacy groups seized the moment, organizing forums and town halls to discuss disparities in the justice system. The Chicago Alliance for Judicial Equity, a nonprofit focused on legal reform, released a statement. Ms. Carter's actions today have highlighted what many in marginalized communities have long known. Bias in our courtrooms is real, and it undermines the very principles of justice. We stand in solidarity with her and call for immediate reforms to ensure fair treatment for all. Community members began sharing their own experiences with Judge Hanson. Stories emerged of harsh fines, dismissive remarks, and unequal treatment. An older woman recounted how Hanson had refused her request for a payment plan on a fine, while a younger white defendant received leniency for the same infraction. One particularly damning account came from a former court clerk who, emboldened by Lila's stand, reached out to a local reporter. "I worked under Judge Hanson for 5 years," she said. "I kept my own records because I noticed a pattern. Fines for Black and Hispanic defendants were consistently higher. Requests for leniency were often denied without explanation." The media spotlight. By evening, the local news stations had picked up the story. Channel 7 Chicago led with the headline, "Federal Prosecutor Exposes Bias in Courtroom." In an on-air segment, journalist Michael Torres interviewed one of the defendants who had been in the courtroom that morning. "It was incredible," said Maria Lopez, a young Latina woman who had received a verbal warning for arriving late. "She stood up not just for herself, but for all of us. I've seen how different people are treated in that courtroom, but no one ever says anything." The story quickly spread beyond Chicago. By the following day, national outlets like the New York Times and CNN were covering the incident, framing it as a pivotal moment in the broader conversation about racial bias in the justice system. A growing movement inspired by Lila's actions, a coalition of local attorneys, community leaders, and activists began pushing for change. They drafted an open letter to the city's Judicial Review Board, demanding an investigation into Judge Hanson's rulings and an audit of municipal court records. Within 48 hours, the letter had garnered over 10,000 signatures. Lila, meanwhile, found herself inundated with messages. Fellow prosecutors reached out to express their support, sharing stories of their own frustrations with the system. Community members thanked her for speaking up. Even strangers sent messages of encouragement, applauding her courage. But for Lila, the most meaningful moment came when she received a handwritten letter from an elderly Black man who had been sitting in the courtroom that morning. "I've seen judges like Hanson all my life," he wrote. "I never thought I'd live to see someone challenge them the way you did. Thank you for standing up. You've given us hope." Lila read the letter twice, her eyes welling with tears. It was a reminder that her fight wasn't just her own. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or devalued by a system that was supposed to protect them. The Judicial Review Board acts. By the end of the week, the Chicago Judicial Review Board announced it would open a formal investigation into Judge Hanson's courtroom practices. A team of investigators began combing through years of records, looking for patterns in fines, sentencing, and treatment of defendants. The announcement was a victory, but Lila knew it was just the first step. The real work, ensuring accountability and enacting lasting change, was still ahead. As she prepared to return to her office, Lila glanced at her phone. A new message from Marcus popped up. "You've started something big, Lila. Let's make sure it doesn't stop here." She smiled, her resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The investigation. The investigation into Judge Gerald Hansen's courtroom began swiftly, spurred by the overwhelming public outcry and the growing mountain of firsthand accounts. Within days of Lila Carter's stand, the Chicago Judicial Review Board announced a formal inquiry into Hansen's rulings, with a special focus on his treatment of late defendants and his history of fines and sentences. For many, it was long overdue. Judicial oversight begins. The committee, composed of legal experts, community leaders, and retired judges, began its work by subpoenaing years of court records from Judge Hansen's tenure. Hundreds of case files were spread across conference tables in a large, windowless room on the 10th floor of the Chicago Judicial Oversight Office. Investigators meticulously combed through every detail, from sentencing patterns to the demographic profiles of defendants. Linda Morales, the lead investigator with over 20 years of experience in judicial audits, was struck almost immediately by what she found. "These numbers don't just hint at bias, they scream it," she told her team, gesturing to a chart that tracked fine amounts over time. One column showed fines for defendants categorized by race, while another showed outcomes based on gender and economic status. The disparities were glaring. Black and Hispanic defendants paid average fines nearly triple those of white defendants for identical offenses. Requests for leniency, such as payment plans or reduced penalties, were denied far more frequently for people of color and economically disadvantaged individuals. Hansen's rulings in small claims cases followed a similar trend, with minority plaintiffs often losing against more affluent defendants, even in cases where the evidence strongly favored them. "It's systemic," Morales said during a briefing. "This isn't just about Judge Hansen. It's a symptom of deeper issues in the way our courts operate." Patterns of discrimination. As the data poured in, the committee began connecting the dots. One particularly damning discovery came from a review of contempt charges. Over the past 3 years, Judge Hansen had fined 45 defendants for tardiness or perceived disrespect. Of those fined, 38 were Black or Hispanic. Only 2 were white, and both of those individuals had their fines dismissed after brief explanations. Another glaring pattern emerged in traffic violations. The committee found that fines issued to Black defendants averaged $500, nearly twice the $260 average for white defendants. These discrepancies weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a consistent pattern that stretched across years of Hansen's rulings. In interviews with defendants, many recounted experiences that echoed Lila's confrontation. A young Black woman described being fined $700 for a minor infraction, despite explaining her financial hardship. A middle-aged Hispanic man shared how Hansen had dismissed his legitimate documentation proving his innocence, only to levy the maximum penalty against him. Their stories painted a damning portrait of a judge who seemed to view minority defendants through a harsher lens. The review committee also uncovered inconsistencies in Hansen's courtroom demeanor. Recordings from courtroom sessions revealed a tone of condescension or impatience when addressing minority defendants. Meanwhile, white defendants often received a more lenient and respectful approach. Courtroom staff speak out. The investigation gained momentum as former courtroom staff began coming forward. Encouraged by the public spotlight on Hansen's behavior, clerks and bailiffs shared stories that had long remained unspoken. James Holloway, a bailiff who had worked under Hansen for over a decade, provided a written statement that detailed years of witnessing unfair treatment. "I saw it almost every day," he wrote. "Defendants who were Black or Hispanic were interrupted more often, fined more heavily, and spoken to in a way that made it clear the judge didn't respect them." Court clerk Rebecca Simmons echoed these sentiments in her testimony. She had kept a personal log of questionable incidents over the years, including dates, case numbers, and descriptions of Hansen's rulings. "It wasn't subtle," Simmons said. "You could see the pattern if you paid attention. I wrote it all down because I knew someday someone would need proof." Their accounts added another layer of credibility to the investigation, reinforcing what the data had already revealed. Holloway and Simmons weren't the only ones. A former assistant clerk who had transferred out of Hansen's courtroom due to stress described the judge's demeanor as intimidating and often discriminatory. One of the most damning revelations came from another court clerk, who described how Hansen occasionally made offhand comments about defendants' appearances or backgrounds. He would joke about someone's inability to pay or question why they even bothered coming to court, the clerk revealed. It was deeply unprofessional. A systemic problem. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Hansen's behavior wasn't just an individual failing, it was emblematic of a broader systemic problem. Other judges in the same district showed similar patterns in their rulings, though not as egregiously. The findings ignited a broader discussion about the need for accountability and reform throughout the judiciary. By the time the investigation concluded, the evidence against Hansen was overwhelming. His actions had not only undermined public trust, but also perpetuated a system of inequality that disproportionately harmed the most vulnerable. The committee prepared a comprehensive report detailing their findings with stark clarity. It wasn't just about one judge anymore. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed such bias to thrive. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would reverberate far beyond Hansen's courtroom. Institutional reform. The reverberations from Lila Carter's stand against Judge Hansen reached every corner of Chicago's legal system. What began as a courtroom confrontation had evolved into a movement demanding accountability and structural change. Within weeks, the city found itself at the center of a national conversation about judicial bias and systemic inequity. The investigation expands. The Chicago Judicial Review Board launched a formal inquiry into Judge Hansen's courtroom practices. Led by senior investigator Angela Martinez, the team pored over 5 years of municipal court records, analyzing fines, sentencing patterns, and judicial remarks. The findings were damning. Black and Hispanic defendants were 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines than white defendants for similar infractions. Requests for payment plans or reduced penalties were routinely denied for minority defendants, while white defendants were often granted leniency. In some cases, disparities in sentencing and fines bordered on outright discrimination. The investigation uncovered not just bias, but also a troubling lack of oversight. Other judges in the municipal court system showed similar patterns, suggesting the problem was far more widespread than Judge Hansen alone. Bias this deeply entrenched doesn't happen in isolation, Martinez stated during a press conference. It's systemic, and addressing it requires systemic solutions. Judge Hansen steps down. Faced with mounting evidence, Judge Hansen was given a choice: resign quietly or face a formal disciplinary hearing. After nearly 3 decades on the bench, Hansen submitted his resignation. "I never realized the extent of my unconscious biases," Hansen said in a brief statement. "I believed I was being fair, but the data shows otherwise. I apologize to those I have wronged and hope this serves as a moment of growth for the entire system." While some viewed his resignation as an act of accountability, others criticized it as insufficient. Community leaders argued that the harm caused by Hansen's rulings required more than an apology. It demanded restitution and reform. Mandatory bias training. In the wake of Hansen's resignation, the Chicago municipal court system announced sweeping reforms. Effective immediately, all judges, clerks, and court staff were required to undergo comprehensive bias training. The program, developed in partnership with legal scholars and civil rights advocates, focused on recognizing and mitigating unconscious bias in judicial decision-making. One of the training sessions featured Hansen himself, who agreed to participate as part of his resignation agreement. In a surprising turn, Hansen spoke candidly about his experiences, admitting that his upbringing and assumptions had influenced his rulings in ways he hadn't previously understood. "I thought treating everyone the same was enough," Hansen said during the training. "But I failed to see how systemic barriers made that approach inherently unequal." Lila attended one of these sessions, sitting quietly in the back. Watching Hansen admit his failings was surreal, but it also reinforced the importance of her actions. Change, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. Courtroom transparency. Another key reform was the introduction of courtroom transparency measures. Judges were now required to document and justify fines, sentencing decisions, and other rulings, with this data made publicly available on a quarterly basis. Independent oversight committees, composed of legal experts and community members, were tasked with reviewing the data to ensure fairness and consistency. The changes didn't stop there. New guidelines were implemented to standardize fines and penalties, reducing the discretionary power that had allowed bias to flourish unchecked. Additionally, courtrooms were equipped with multilingual signage and staffed with community liaisons to assist defendants unfamiliar with legal procedures. These measures aimed to make the judicial process more accessible and equitable for all. Lila's growing role. Lila's role in sparking these changes didn't go unnoticed. She was invited to join a newly formed Judicial Equity Commission, tasked with monitoring the implementation of reforms and advising on further improvements. In her first meeting, Lila emphasized the importance of data-driven solutions. "This isn't about one judge or one courtroom," she said. "It's about creating a system where every defendant, regardless of race, background, or status, is treated with dignity and fairness." She also began mentoring young attorneys, sharing her experience to inspire the next generation of legal professionals. Her story became a case study at law schools, illustrating the power of individual action in driving systemic change. Community impact. The reforms resonated far beyond the legal community. Local organizations reported an increase in public trust in the judicial system, with more defendants feeling empowered to challenge unfair rulings. Community forums became spaces for open dialogue between legal professionals and the public, fostering a sense of collaboration and accountability. Even those who had long been disillusioned by the system found hope in the changes. The elderly Black man who had written to Lila attended one of the first community oversight meetings. "This is what justice should feel like," he told her afterward, his voice thick with emotion. Fair, honest, and for everyone. A national movement. Chicago's reforms inspired similar efforts in other cities. Judicial oversight committees were established in Los Angeles, New York, and Atlanta, each taking cues from Chicago's transparency and training initiatives. Lila received invitations to speak at national conferences, where she shared her insights and pushed for broader adoption of these measures. The media continued to follow her journey, framing her as a symbol of courage and accountability in a flawed system. In an interview with the New York Times, Lila reflected on the journey. "Justice isn't just about the law. It's about the people it serves. If we aren't willing to challenge the system when it fails, we're complicit in its failures." Looking ahead. 3 months after the reforms were enacted, the Chicago judicial system released its first public report on courtroom data. The results showed a significant reduction in racial disparities in fines and sentencing, though work remained to be done. For Lila, the report was a reminder that change was possible, but not easy. She framed her $700 fine receipt and hung it in her office as a symbol of the fight for justice, a fight she was determined to continue. Personal impact. The framed receipt hung prominently on the wall of Lila Carter's office. It wasn't just a record of the $700 fine Judge Hanson had imposed. It was a symbol of something much greater. Positioned next to her certificates and accolades, the receipt served as a daily reminder of the power of standing up to injustice, even in the face of authority. For Lila, it represented a pivotal moment in her career, one where her principles and courage had sparked a ripple effect far beyond what she could have imagined. Every time she glanced at it, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about the injustice she had faced that day in municipal court. It was about the countless individuals who had suffered quietly under a biased system, their voices unheard and their stories untold. The receipt was a call to action, a commitment to keep fighting for equality in every facet of the justice system. Community support. As news of Lila's stand continued to spread, her office became a hub of activity. Letters, emails, and messages poured in from across the country. Many came from young attorneys and law students who saw her as a role model, someone who had fearlessly challenged a system that many believed was immovable. One letter from a second-year law student stood out. "Miss Carter, I've always struggled with whether I could truly make a difference as a lawyer. Watching what you did that day inspired me to believe in the power of our profession again. You've shown me that even the smallest acts of courage can create change. Thank you for giving me hope." Lila kept the letter on her desk alongside dozens of others. Each one reaffirmed her belief in the importance of her actions. Many of the writers shared their own experiences of bias and discrimination, thanking her for shedding light on an issue that had long been ignored. In response, Lila made it a priority to mentor the next generation of legal professionals. She began hosting workshops and speaking at law schools, sharing her story as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. Her sessions weren't just about courtroom strategy or legal theory. They were about ethics, courage, and the responsibility that came with being part of the justice system. At these events, Lila was candid about the challenges she had faced as a Black woman in law, from subtle microaggressions to overt displays of bias. But she also spoke of resilience and the importance of finding allies. Change doesn't happen overnight, she often told her audiences, but it starts with moments like these, moments where we choose to stand up, even when it's difficult. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Civil rights organizations invited her to speak at their conferences. Legal associations sought her input on reform initiatives, and universities requested her to lead seminars on systemic bias. Lila's office soon became a gathering place for young lawyers and activists, all eager to learn from her and contribute to the movement she had helped ignite. A symbol of change, Lila's story quickly became more than a viral moment. It became a case study in law schools and legal forums nationwide. Professors used her experience to illustrate the intersection of bias, authority, and accountability in the justice system. Students debated the ethical implications of her actions and the systemic issues her stand had exposed. At one such lecture, a student asked, "What made you speak out that day? Weren't you afraid of retaliation?" Lila's response was simple but powerful. "I was afraid," she admitted. But fear doesn't excuse silence. The real question I asked myself was, if I don't say something, who will? Her words resonated deeply, becoming a rallying cry for judicial reform advocates. Organizations dedicated to equity in the legal system adopted her story as a cornerstone of their campaigns. The hashtag #JusticeWith Carter trended repeatedly on social media, symbolizing not just her stand, but a collective push for fairness in the courts. The ripple effects of her actions were profound. Law schools introduced new courses focused on identifying and addressing bias in the legal system. Advocacy groups used her case as evidence in their petitions for broader judicial oversight. Even federal agencies took notice, incorporating her recommendations into nationwide training programs for judges and court staff. For Lila, the most rewarding moments came not from accolades or recognition, but from the quiet victories. The young lawyer who decided to stay in the profession because of her example. The judge who reevaluated their own practices after reading about her case. The defendant who felt empowered to contest their treatment in court because they had seen her story. The framed fine receipt in her office wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a testament to the power of a single voice. And for Lila, it was a promise to keep using hers to fight for a justice system that truly lived up to its name. 3 months after Lila Carter walked into Judge Hanson's courtroom, the ripple effects of her stand continued to spread, reshaping the justice system in ways she hadn't anticipated. The changes weren't just procedural, they were cultural, marking a shift in how fairness and accountability were understood and implemented within courtrooms. The Chicago Municipal Court, once viewed by many as an impenetrable bastion of outdated practices, now bore tangible signs of reform. A newly established oversight committee conducted monthly reviews of court rulings, fines, and sentencing to ensure consistency and equity. Judges underwent mandatory bias training, and public reports were issued to maintain transparency. In the main lobby of the courthouse, a plaque had been installed, engraved with the words, "Justice is not just a law, it is how we treat every individual who stands before it." Below the inscription was the date of Lila's court appearance, commemorating the moment that sparked this wave of change. A legacy of courage. For Lila, the experience had been transformative. Though her work as a federal prosecutor continued, her role had expanded into that of a reform advocate and mentor. She frequently spoke at events, sharing not only her story, but also her vision for a more just legal system. The framed fine receipt in her office remained a constant reminder of the journey she had begun. Visitors often asked about it, and she would explain with a mix of humility and determination how something so small had led to something so significant. It's not about the fine, she would say. It's about what it represents. Every act of courage, no matter how small, can spark change. What matters is that we choose to act. Letters and messages continued to pour in from around the country. Students, lawyers, and everyday citizens saw Lila's stand as a beacon of hope. A young attorney from Atlanta wrote, "Your story has inspired me to believe that justice isn't a lofty ideal. It's something we fight for every day in every courtroom." The broader impact. The reforms in Chicago inspired similar initiatives nationwide. Cities like New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles adopted Lila's recommendations, introducing measures to address systemic bias in their own courts. National advocacy organizations began using her story as a case study, encouraging local communities to hold their judicial systems accountable. At law schools across the country, professors integrated Lila's experience into their curricula. Students studied her actions, dissecting the legal, ethical, and cultural implications of standing up to judicial authority. Many cited her as the reason they pursued careers in law, determined to continue the work she had begun. For Lila, the most profound moments came in quiet, personal interactions. During a visit to her alma mater, Northwestern University, a student approached her after a lecture. "I just want to say thank you," the student said, her voice trembling. "You've shown me that it's possible to make a difference, even when the odds are against you." Lila smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "It's always possible," she replied, "but it takes all of us to make it happen." A promise for the future. As Lila walked through the halls of the courthouse one morning, she passed by the newly installed plaque. A familiar elderly man from the courtroom that day stopped beside her. "You've changed things," he said softly, his eyes glistening. "Not just for me, but for so many." Lila nodded, her resolve unwavering. "We've changed things," she replied, "and we're not done yet." Justice, she realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And while there was still much work to be done, Lila Carter knew she had taken the first step. Her voice had carried the weight of a community's hopes, and her courage had lit the way for others to follow. As she left the courthouse that day, the sun shone brightly over Chicago, illuminating the path ahead. A path toward a justice system that truly lived up to its name. Would you like further adjustments or expansions on this conclusion?